to start. All right, hello and welcome to my first intro to sound design workshop. You can call it a class, but it's a more informal way of getting folks um, introduced to very fundamental concepts that are very important in sound design that almost nobody has really taught us how to do, but extremely important. So, um, so, um, so before we start writing some code, I kind of just want to gauge like maybe familiarity with Strudel. It's um, it's really easy to get started with Strudel, but the thing is that because it allows you a lot of freedom, it also requires you to know quite a few basics before you can be productive. And so the goal of these workshops um, is to kind of get new folks familiarized with basic syntax and also building the basic building blocks so that you can be more productive, or at least have a framework to be able to um, work with code, work with really simple code, and use that to build something a little bit more complex. Um, and that's why in these introductory workshops, I would try to stay away from introducing concepts like FMH, LFOs, even distortion is something, although it's very interesting, I would not introduce folks in this session because one, you can explore it on yourself, and two, it's not foundational to sound design, right? Um, what sound design really is that you need to have a basic understanding of how sound works at a very fundamental level. And the easiest way to demonstrate that is is a sine wave. And I know you've seen videos probably explaining what a sine wave is and uh, why it's so why is it like the most natural waveform, the natural oscillating waveform that we use, because it's the most natural waveform for all things, light waves, sound waves, the waves in the ocean, um, even wind, um, how sound compresses in the air to produce sound. They're basically represented by the same basic signal, which is sine. And, and I'm sure you're pretty familiar with what this does, right? So, so I can give you a really simple example of a sine wave. Here I'm set a frequency of 110, which is an A note. I believe it's A2, sound of sine, and I'm going to add a scope. So I think the scope is a little bit too small, so I'm going to increase the height and the width a little bit. Maybe the thickness. All right. And I'm going to press update. Okay. And yeah, during the workshop, I'm going to, if there's any questions, you're free to you're free to input in the text message in the chat box, and then in halftime I'll answer all of your questions in the text box itself. Um, for those of you who wants to speak, there's going to be a Q&A reserved at the end of the 90-minute session. So so it's nice to have everyone muted at this time. Um, but yeah, of course, the 8 minute, if we have time, I open up for any questions as well. Okay. Then scale probably 1.5. Um, okay. Nice and round. So, so this is a basic waveform, and the sine wave they're playing at is at 110 hertz, which is one cycle takes 1 over 10, 1 over 110 seconds to complete. That is one oscillation, right? If I go down 55, then it's 1 over 55 seconds to complete one oscillation. And one oscillation is just from the peak. Actually, it's from 0 to the peak, and then the valley, and then back to 0. That is one period, right? So what happens is that an audio signal, when it oscillates like that, when it oscillates 55 times a second, when it oscillates 110 times a second, it causes it causes voltage in the speaker to basically compress or move, basically move up and down to compress air, and and the pattern of that compression will be the same as the audio signal, right? So so the peak represents the maximum amplitude, that's what we call an amplitude of the speaker, and then the valley represents the minimum amplitude, the position of the speaker. So that's how it produces sound, right? And and no, I'm not going to go into details into hardware mechanics in this course. That's really out of topic. But um, by the fundamental level, as long as you can understand how these audio signals translate to sound, you can create all sorts of interesting patterns and really see how it affects the output of the sound, right? Um, so let's start with 110 fundamental frequency. And when I say fundamental frequency, it just means that it's the pure tone, the lowest pure tone of every sound that we're gonna make in designing a sound. So, so let's forget the names for now. I'm just gonna start with 110 hertz, and then we can start building it from higher and higher frequencies. But 110 is gonna be our lowest, our base frequency, our base fundamental frequency. And um, um, and it's useful that we set a baseline so that we can always reference back to this frequency and say that, okay, no matter how many overtones, no matter how many uh, higher pitches sound that we layer on top of this frequency, the bass, how we perceive the tone, the pitch, is going to be at a 2 note, which is the 110 hertz. I'm going to add some colors here just to make things a little bit easier to distinguish. So I'm just going to start with basic color. Hello, hello. We have another attendant, participant. Welcome. Welcome. Yeah, we just got started. So, so yeah, I'm just introducing the concept of the fundamental tone, which right now is set at 110. For simplicity's sake, it's the A2 note. And right now, the oscilloscope is showing the signal of this sine wave, right? shall we? Maybe, yeah, 7. So I'm gonna click play. Let me refresh. Sometimes the color doesn't register. Um, there we go. Now it registers. Um, so, so our base frequency is going to be red or reddish orange, right? And for beginner's sake, um, we'll introduce the stack functions and really more advanced functions at the end. But for now, I'm just gonna do a copy paste because it's the fastest, and I'm not gonna change very much of anything, if any. So so now the question comes is, now we have our fundamental frequency 110 hertz, right? What happens when we add a uh, second frequency at at the same hertz, right? And if we keep play, you can see that they're exactly the same. And the question now is like, how do they stack up? How do these two waveforms stack up, right? Yeah, sure. Felix, feel free to keep the mic off, and I'll open the questions at halftime and also at the end of Q&A. So that will be the time to ask questions. But you're free to type in any questions you like in the text box. I'll get to it during the half-point break and also towards the end. Perfect. Oh, hello, hello. We have a third participant here. Welcome, welcome. So right now we're just going through just having two fundamental tones and adding, and really see what happens when we add those waves together. Yes, recording. Yeah, I am recording. Thanks for the reminder. So in Strudel, to be able to stack these two waveforms together in a different set of patterns, I can either use stack or I can just use the global scope function. And basically what it does is it stacks, it basically combines all the audio signal into one single audio signal and then analyzes that audio signal, right? So that's why you get like extreme, like really tall waveforms, because it's basically two waveforms stacked. Sorry, it's basically what you're seeing is two waveforms of the same amplitude stacked together. That's why it's so tall. And also the scale is it's scaled 1.5, which is a lot for the global scope. So if I do a single one, right, it's going to be like that. If I do a second one, it's going to be double. And that is called amplitude modulation. Well, if you want to use the word modulation, for simplicity's sake, let's just say it's something like 1 + 1 = 2, because at each peak is 1, and if you add the peak of 1, the peak is going to be double, so it's going to be 2. And the same thing happens at -1, right? The lowest point here is -1, and so if you stack a second wave here, it's going to be -2, and that's why you see this really tall waveform. I realize I really need to scale down the global scope here. It's a little bit too tall. Okay, let's go back to our inline scope. Now we have established what it means by fundamental frequency, which is just a pure tone at the pitch that we define, 110 hertz. Now we can talk about overtones, right? And the concept of overtones is really simple. It's not some complicated mathematical formula. It's not. It's basically just means the fundamental frequency multiplied by a certain number. right? So in here, I'm just multiplied by 2, and this one is just multiplied by 1, which is itself. Oh yeah, you absolutely lose the audio during if the tone is being played. It's definitely interfering a lot with my voice because of how the mic is internal to my laptop. But next time I'll have my mic set up hopefully. Cool. So 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 when we add an overtone like this, we want to see what happens to the waveform, right? And so let's do a different color. Maybe let's just shift the hue a little bit. And you can you can pretty easily tell that uh, the first overtone, or we call it the first harmonic overtone, is half the wavelength of the first one. So if we line up these two signals together, one period, one period. It's really hard to draw and describe it. One period here is exactly same as two periods. I'm just thinking, wouldn't it be nice if we can like kind of like superimpose like these two in Strudel? I think that would be a really nice feature, but that's for another day. And the color is not changing again, so I'm just going to reload this page. There we go. Now we see that this is yellow, right? So when I play these, you notice that there's two tones actually playing, like, and you'd be like, yeah, duh, because there's two patterns, and each pattern is playing a tone of, the second pattern is playing a tone that's double, that's one octave higher, right? Doubling the frequency increases the octave by one. That is a very simple concept that anyone should have learned in Music Theory 101, because that's how our ears perceive octaves before, even like way before the Western 12-note equal temperament scale is being invented. Ancient music systems are using the same principles of octaves, doubling of the frequency, right? And so right now we have two tones, and naturally you ask the question, what happens if we stack these two tones together, right? Would the amplitude be as high as what we showed in the first one? Well, let's find out. So I'm just gonna combine these two waveforms into one by using the global scope function, and then I'm just gonna have the scale for now because it's the waveforms tend to be really tall when they are stacked together. So let's click play and see what happens. Now I can't really freeze this, but you can see that's why now we have to use that, because I really want to show a frozen frame of that. Yep. Scale 1, and excuse me here, just gonna comment out the scope, the inline scope, and I'm just gonna use the inline scope at the end with the same parameters. And since this is a combined scope, I'm just gonna use the color white, not worry about each individual waveform color. Unexpected token 19.2. This is, oh yeah, because there's there's a comment in line that's not supposed to be there. Okay. Oh, unterminated parenthesis. Perfect. So, so this answers the question. We stack two tones with the interval of the distance is one octave between two notes or two frequencies. We get a waveform like that, and I don't know if there's a name for this, but it's basically just a fundamental tone plus one harmonic, which is the next one. And what you can see is basically this. For each period, for each period, we can see the general pattern of the fundamental tone at 110 hertz, the first one, right? And then we can also see the pattern of the second one kind of enclosed within the first one, as you can see here. We have this additional kind of S shape that is manifested within the complete one period of the fundamental waveform. And this is why it's so interesting to like study these patterns, because when you see it, you believe it. And when you hear it, you believe it even more. So being able to see it and hear it at the same time, it helps you learn, at least it helps me learn. As a person with ADHD, that's really, really helpful. Um, so so the next thing is like, can I add a third one, right? Can I add a third one? Well, absolutely, right? Um, we go on and add third one. You can basically expect the same thing happening again, which is you can probably guess what happens next, right? The third one means there's three cycles within the cycle of the first one, so you can see like it's going to be warped a little bit even more to fit in the 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 second harmonic here, right? So if I can play it, you can see that there's three wave patterns here. Isn't it interesting? And the second one is preserved, this one, right? And the first fundamental is this really big one. And if you're doing really complex mathematics here, like the answer is no, because it's the same as 1 plus 1 equals 2. What we're doing is we're just adding these three waveforms together. Uh, we're just stacking them. So stacking is like addition of the audio signals, right? Um, Now I haven't introduced the concept of interference and also constructive interference and destructive interference, and that will come out in the next topic here. But now we have now we have three tones, right? The fundamental, the first harmonic, and the second one. You can play a little bit around on the volume of each of these to kind of manipulate the sound a little bit. Um, and and manipulating the sound this way is called changing the timbre, changing the timbre of the sound. It determines the quality of the sound, of whether it's a verb, a piano, a bell, whatever, etc., etc. But it's using the same concepts, right? It determines by how many harmonics you have and also the amplitude of each harmonic. And amplitude, I'm just going to use gain here. And and I'm just going to slap a FX here so that the gains don't overlap on each other. Because what tends to happen in Strudel is that in the effects chain, if you just call gain like that, either the first one will just override the rest, or the last one will just override the first one. It's get really confusing. So the FX guarantee that the gains are applied in order and sequentially applied, right? So the gain of one, the gain of one is the same, right? We just stack three, we just stack three of the waveforms together, and that's why it sounds really loud. Uh, you can see it's already clipping, and by clipping I mean the top part of the waveform goes beyond what the speaker can produce, and that's why you get a distorted sound. See, like this is now I've already introduced you the concept of distortion without actually using distort. Uh, Distortion is just basically this, right? You clip some parts of the waveform to make it sound like to make it sound like speakers are blasting, and the term for that is overdrive, but it's really just a kind of like an effect that some people like in making their sounds, but it's just basically this, right? Um, at the fundamental level. So I'm just gonna half or ratio this a little bit so that it normalizes. Oh, that's a little bit too soft. Um, Maybe 3/4. 3/4 is sweet. Perfect. Now I can start playing with these numbers, right? And then I can just use a slider, and then we'll just call it 0, between 0 and 1, and then each step is going to be 1/4. Got to keep track of time. We're at 26 minutes now. Um, cool. So we have a slider here. Unexpected token, 21, 71. Very, very interesting. I wonder if slider is just not allowed inside of the FX. No. Oh, I think I have again the unterminated parenthesis. No, now it works. Okay, so I guess we can't use slider in the FX. So now we can play around with uh, the ratios, right? For example, if the first one is 1, the second one, let's say we'll just half it. In the third one, let's just say uh, we do a 1/3. So something a regular pattern, right? I like regular patterns because what you output is a regular pattern, and then from there you can form these mental building blocks of like, okay, if I apply this pattern to this pattern, it's going to produce this output, right? If I apply inverse pattern, it's going to produce this output. So now I have these models that I can basically really quickly, next time when I want to produce a similar sound, I can use this pattern. And these patterns can be applied to other sorts of sound design as well. So um, I'm going to use even ratios here. Of course, you're free to experiment and use really random numbers if you want. So just to give you a more kind of like an orderly, a more structured way of experimenting. Right. So let's see what happens, right? If I click play. Oh, what happened? The the sound wave suddenly looks a little bit more straight, even though there's a little bit, even though that's a little bit crooked. It's not completely smooth. It's not completely straight, but we can see that it's generally getting straighter. Uh, and it's interesting, right? It's like a breakthrough. It's like what just happened. And while there's a mathematical explanation for this, uh, I want you to think about again using the same concept of like, okay, the first the first fundamental tone, we can see it still retains a similar shape. And what happens if we kind of halve the second, the, the, the first harmonic is that the ripple becomes smaller, right? Um, the ripple doesn't it isn't as big as if I were to just do one, right? You can see that it really crinkles it up a lot. And then if I do 2/3, it's going to be less. If I do 1/3, it's going to be even less until it becomes almost just the first tone. And then if I add a third one, I'm only giving it a little bit. I can still hear the third tone, but it's really faint in the background, right? I can still hear all three tones, but the third one is very faint. And what if I add a fourth one? I add a fourth one, I add a fifth one, I add a sixth one. I'm just gonna add harmonics from now on. Now I have 6. And I decide that each one is gonna be even smaller than the previous one. I don't think these color matters anymore, but I'm just gonna keep it in the same pattern. And suddenly, my line is getting a lot straighter than before. And now it suddenly sounds like something different. Even though I only have 6, even though I only have 6 signals stacked together. Okay, water break here. Now instead of doing, I think I'm gonna do the pattern a little bit more like this. So I really want to accentuate the effects of all of these frequency, right? I still want to see like the effects of the last one. So I'm just going to do it a little bit more. And I'm going to click play and see what happens. I really don't know what happens. Oh. Now you can see that it's really sharp now. And why is it sharp? Why does it sound like you can hear that there's a really sharp overtone. And it makes sense because the sixth tone here, or the fifth harmonic, is cranked up to half of the first one, which is a sizable volume, and has a sizable impact on shaping the waveform. And each one, of course, have a sizable impact. That's why you see these wiggly lines, right? Because they do impact the final shape of the waveform. So you can do your own exercise and figure out like how these all stacks, but I want you to notice this notch here, because that's where the sharpness comes from. The sixth tone is giving us this really sharp, because it lines up almost perfectly with the first tone. And not only the sixth one, I think the third, fifth, and sixth, because they start at the beginning, it becomes sharper and sharper, right? You add two sine waveforms together, it becomes really, really tall and sharp. And this is a very interesting part, right? I can continue to mess around with this, but eventually you will find that as I add on as I have 8 tones now, the fundamental and the harmonics, and these ones are just going to be smaller and smaller and smaller. Um, and I'm just going to do a post game here so that it doesn't blast your speakers. Oh, actually, we can go a little bit. So I'm just guessing numbers, man. I'm not following a mathematical formula, but you can see what happens. The first one, it starts at 1, and then I decrease it by a little bit, decrease it by a little bit, a little bit, a little bit, until the last one is only has a little bit impact. It's a pattern uh, that I'm stacking 8 frequencies. Is each one is a multiple of the first one, and then I'm also stacking the amplitude that is each subsequent one is lower than the first one. And you can see it changes the shape. It completely changes the shape now. Now it looks like a sawtooth wave to me. It has this really sharp start, and it has this mostly smooth line. And the reason why it's completely smooth is because it's not following a mathematical formula. That's why it's not so even. But you can see that I can already quote unquote design my sound this way by just using harmonics. Um, so, so this is it. This is like the basics of changing how a sound sounds. Using only 8 tones, and I can go indefinitely, right? Like modern synth, modern oscillators probably has like I don't know, 32, 64, 128 harmonics, up until the very end of the high frequency spectrum, the very sharp, to like really sharpen this, which I'm not gonna do here because you can just define a saw wave and it'll do that for you. So we know that by decreasing gains, we can make like a saw wave pattern. Uh, Now the question for you is that how do we make other shapes like a square? And the really funny thing about the square um, is that without thinking about mathematics, you can envision a square wave as just like 0 and 1 switching on and off, right? So the pattern would be something like 1 0 1 0 1 0. Like I'm just gonna try this out. Like I haven't actually tried this out, but I'm just gonna try this out and see what happens, right? And again, post game, I'm just gonna have it where set it at a low amount so that it doesn't blast the speakers. Interesting. Okay. Interesting pattern, if you ask me. Uh, why is it interesting? Because it's like it's like flipping a switch on and off, right? So I'm only stacking frequencies on the odd harmonics, 1, 3, 5, and 7, and and yeah, I want to go back to that scope example so that we can see. Hopefully this works. And then the scale, just gonna say 2. The color isn't okay. Post gain 1/4. Yeah, I think. Oh, I think what happened is that because there's a final scope here, it's gonna combine all the audio signals just to the final one, so it just eats up all of the previous one. Another good thing to know about strudel. Doesn't quite stack. There. And let's say I just want to put this scale of 4. So what happens is that the the first one will line up exactly the same as 3 of these, and then it will line up the same as exactly 5 of these, and then 7 of these. And this is where the concept of destructive interference come into play. Uh, without explaining too much, it just means that if I have two waveforms of the opposite signal, then they'll cancel each other out because we're doing like 1 minus 1. It's like doing a sine and a cosine. So I'm just gonna mute this, and I'm just gonna copy the first one, right? So I'm just gonna say this one is sine, this one is there like a z cosine pattern? No, sounds. There's a z sine. Okay. So you're gonna do a phase shift here. Phase shift is let's do late by if I do late by this, it's gonna be a full cycle, so I'm just gonna do late by half cycle, and then see what happens. There's a function called phases, which is probably a little bit advanced, but that's a really easy way to do a phase shift. Okay, so phases 0.5, yeah. That is. The scope won't show the phases. Uses triggering to align waveforms. Oh, you're right. It aligns at 0, right? So it's not gonna. Yeah, it aligns at phase 0. Okay, so I can't really demonstrate. I can't really demonstrate this with the with the scope, unfortunately. But I can certainly do a stack on these two, and it should cancel out just nicely, right? Like that is what I wanna kind of achieve here. There's a little experimentation going on for strudel. And then here. There we go. So when I click play, nothing happens. There's no sound. Interesting, right? It's because the phasing is doing something to it, or is it just busted because the partials didn't specify? there's also a ribbon function too. So I can offset the cycle by let's say one cycle, and then it's gonna loop for another cycle, right? Hold on 1 second. It's not playing any sound. Oh, because I didn't even specify the global specifier. There we go. Live coding 1-on-1. Okay. It still doesn't phase. Let's do a ribbon. Should be no change. Ribbon 0.5. Nope. Sometimes I just want to try like using different samples to see if it actually does the ribbon. I think ribbon applies to the cycles of the pattern, not the cycle of the individual period, right? So, anyways, I'm just gonna figure out this later, and then go back to example here. But it'll be really nice to see like the stacking, as we can see at the end here, right? It's a little bit, it looks a little bit more like square now, but except that this middle part is kind of like still close to zero. Um, and the question that the same question that I have is like, why does it, why does it, why does it do that? Isn't square is just a simple like 0 and 1 over the odd harmonic, and that is partially true. But later I found out it's that, oh yeah, you also need to apply the same pattern of like decreasing amplitude, because otherwise it's going to stack so perfectly that um, that only the sharpest point are just going to add up, and then anything in the middle is they're going to phase themselves out to 0. So would have to do something like 1/3, and then this one like 1/5, and then 1/7, and then now it looks more like a square, right? Oops, too loud. Yep. So now I'm a little bit more mathematical in the sense that the first time we established a pattern to do a saw wave, we actually did a decreasing, a uniform decreasing, and it looks the pattern looks more irregular, instead of having really sharp corners. And now we use the same pattern. We can see that a more regular pattern is being formed, although it hasn't looked too much like a square yet, because I haven't added 16 or 32 harmonics. That is how we get the really sharp and really nice square form. But we can already see that the shape is starting to take place. If I increase the amplitude of the odd one, you can see that it becomes even more square, right? Except it has these wiggly thing, because it's now I'm at a more kind of like an odd number, and I'm doing it odd, and I'm doing it this one sequentially, like 1, 2, 3, 1. That's why ratios are so fun, right? You create these patterns, and you kind of ask yourself, like, how do I create these patterns? Oh, it's because these numbers follow decreasing by some amount, and then these ones, they go a factor by increasing a different amount. And since they don't overlap perfectly, they don't phase out perfectly, and that's why you get kind of like these wavy patterns. Anyways, that will be the extent of math that I'm going to today. So I think we're at half. Are we at halftime? Yeah, we're at halftime. So um, maybe let's just say give 10 minutes for questions, shall we? Yeah. Um, just gonna share. Yeah, some people call it the Fourier series. Um, and using a rotating visualization to visualize like the sound, the sine waves, right? Because when you draw it on a 2D axis, it's going to show a sine wave over time, right? Yeah, this one. There we go. Yeah, this is perfect example, right? Um, although don't go into the detail of the math here, you can see that everything in nature is everything that oscillates in nature in a regular interval is going to form a sine wave. Like a wheel on the car that moves, it's going to form a sine wave. Um, it's going to go up and down, just like this pattern. And yeah, this example is very interesting because you see I'm just adding more circles, right? And each circle is basically half the radius of the previous one. And what half the radius of each one is that you can see each circle rotates as twice the speed as the main circle, which means the frequency doubles, right? So if you stack all of these circles together, and if you draw it from the origin point of each circle, you're going to form the same thing that we saw earlier, which is it's going to look more and more like a saw wave with really sharp ends, right? Because we're not decreasing the amplitude over that. Like each circle, it's still going to receive the full amplitude. Um, we're going to draw it at full strength. Um, so they're just going to stack. Beware of the three body problem here. The three body problem is another thing. Um, yeah. So the square wave is like the odd harmonics, where you have the first one radius 1, the second is a 1/3 of the radius, and the third one is 1/5 of the radius. Uh, so you get a square wave. Triangle wave is a little bit interesting. Uh, it's a little bit like square, but the amplitude is the pattern is for each additional harmonic. I think the amplitude is like 1/square of that number, right? Yeah, you have -1 and +1/2 times 8 pi times 2, sorry, pi square times n square. Yep, the n square thing. So it's 1/n squared, right? It's 1/n squared. So regular mathematical patterns form regular waveforms shapes. And often they can form really smooth lines like these because the waves just kind of sync and the phases kind of cancel each other out in regular intervals so that they form a smooth line. Not oh. Yeah, it takes a lot of experimentation to get it right. Just like in strudel, it takes a lot of trial and error to get the shape that you want, right? But at the end of it, sound design is about what you hear. It's not only just about what you see, unless you want to do a like visualization presentation like on your screen, like doing like Hydra, whatever, like a big scope with your music, and if you want to really get the shape right, then yeah, your sound design has to be has to match with that shape, right? Which is also what I'm really excited about, learning all of these things. Um, cool. And I'm gonna reshare. Sorry about that. Back to Strudel. All right, we have 5 more minutes. Any other questions? No, I see that Rick has to drop top the hour. Yeah, at the end of it, I'll have the recording ready. Let me double check my recording. Okay, it's still recording. Perfect. At the end of it, I'll have the recording ready. Might upload it to YouTube because Discord doesn't allow really large uploads. So it might take a while to process, right? Depending on, if I want to edit some stuff like that. Cool. And for any of you curious about this, it's just a pre-bake that I'm making my own pre-bake before anything, and I can see it so that when I click play, I know what happens and what to tweak. Because this pre-bake is pretty much a style pre-bake. It's not a strudel pre-bake. It's like I want to style my editor in a certain way. So if I reload this page, you can see that it's not style, right? It's the original strudel or original theme, like one of the defaults. And I see that, yeah, like I like the font to be my own, and I don't like this background color. It's too light. I want it black, like almost black, and I want it. I don't want a background on each of these lines, and I can do CSS filters like brightness, saturate, letter spacing, and I can even selectively hide lines, which I just found out today that I can do. I can use this selector, which is like pretty funny if you do that. So if I execute this code, you can see that all of my pre-baked stuff get folded in, and I don't have to see it. So the code still runs. It's just that I don't need to see it anymore. I can just go, do my own thing, and it just clears up a lot of clutter later on. So there's, yeah, we covered the 4 basic shapes. I think triangle is just the square, so it's like 1/9, and then this one's 1/25, 1/49. And I mean, it doesn't do very much because it's like it's so small that it doesn't do much. But what if, let's say, I just don't have the first one? Yeah, now it looks more like a triangle. It has a little bit sharpness on the edge, right? But it's like all wonky now. I don't know why. I think the phasing is just a little bit off. And they don't have the first one. Yeah. Thanks for attending, and glad you stayed, and have some interesting things to share with us as well. So yeah, look for the recording, and I'll have my next session maybe next week, maybe in 2 weeks. So, yep, I'll see you then. So, um, so right now we go through the fundamentals of harmonics. Um, at least what I, it's not everything, but it's enough for you to get started. um, I'm going to, we're going to build a supersaw, right? So, so a supersaw is the supersaw is one of the very fundamental sounds that you hear very often from a lot of songs because it's so iconic, um, right? If you don't know what a super song is, I'm just going to show you an example here so you can see what's going on. Okay, one. Out there, just gonna tame it down a little bit. Okay, so this is a regular saw wave, right? We can build our own like just now, or we can just use the sound saw to build our sound wave. And a super saw, in Strudel, it's actually very nice and handy that there is a super saw oscillating sound that you can use uh, right out of the box. So there's no tweaking required, although there's certain really useful parameters like detune. It just comes right out of the box, right? There's no plugins that you need. There's no, it's not an outside sample, so you don't lose quality when you stretch it. Um, and so let's just play it, right? A little bit louder. So you can see that it's like a saw within the saw. And and you can see that there's bigger saw. There's bigger saw teeth. There's the bigger one, and then there's the smaller one as well. There's like teeth within teeth. And then it makes you wonder like, how do I make this sound, right? Because this sound is so iconic. It's used in every single pop song, basically. Maybe at a higher pitch, right? If this is A3, then then it sounds like a pop song, right? I can make a pop song with this sound. And this is where as someone who just started to make music and really wanted to make these synths, a lot of times folks will just use out of the box super saw and just kind of tweak it. But what I want to show you here is it's not just to use a default sort of plugin or a default sample and then tweak it to your liking, because I feel that is very limited. Instead, we're going to rely on what we have learned so far in our harmonic section and apply to building our own super saw. That way we can have complete control of each one of these. I guess you can call it harmonic. I guess you can call it a superimpose, which I'm going to show you in a little bit. So I'm going to start at 110 because that's just the most basic. And then I'm going to start with a simple saw. That's the more simple the shape that you start with, the more control that you have. And since I want to build a super saw, I want to start with the most basic wave shape, which is the saw. not necessarily the sine wave, although I can make a saw with the sine wave, but that would just take too long, right? I want a perfect saw to start with. Like, I don't really care about how I built that, I just want a perfect saw. So gives us a nice and clean saw. There's also a Z saw sample. I think Z saw tooth. Yeah. It's like completely straight and very simple. You can use that if you want to, but I'm gonna stick with the regular sawtooth because it feels more natural. It does have this really bright overtones. You can see that because it's basically just using a bunch of sine waves like we see before, and they're stacking them, right? So it's still gonna form a straight line, but at the very end of it, you can see that. Because the phasing it's not like 100% perfect at the very high frequency, it's not gonna there's some imperfections here, let's just call it that, right? I'm not going to go into detail why it happens other than it just happens with kind of like a natural oscillating saw wave, but this is the wave, this is the audio signal that every synthesizer produces using analog signals. So I'm just going to start with this. And as you can see earlier, a supersaw is just one big saw with like smaller saw teeth. And you might be tempted to say, hey, why not just add a second harmonic, right? And you can. And I'm just going to demonstrate to you how it sounds with an additional overtone. Yeah, it sounds pretty much a lot more like our super saw now, right? There's smaller teeth inside a bigger tooth. But one thing you notice, there is a difference here, because a super saw is only playing with one pitch, one basic pitch. Although there's multiple overtones, and this one is I'm stacking the two harmonics together. And although this is one of the ways you can make a super saw, I can also set the gain like lower to make it like to make it a little bit less regular. You notice that I still can hear two tones of the sawtooth. One at 110 hertz, and the second one at 200 hertz. One at A2, one at A3. A super saw has less of those really bright, what do you call? You don't hear the second fundamental as much, right? You hear mostly one pitch. And you wonder like, well, can I just stack like a lot of overtones and just like, similar to our sine example before? You can, but it's gonna take a lot of work because you're gonna mess around with more than 8 overtones and kind of mess with each one of those, which is a lot of work. So instead we're going to use a simple way to kind of simulate this, right? And one of the techniques that Supersaw uses is detuning. And why detuning is so effective is that when you superimpose two waves, and if one wave is slightly detuned from the first wave, in some areas the phase is gonna come in phase, and sometimes out of phase, you can see that the smaller teeth start to form in more unpredictable ways, and that's how you can hear Um, it's how you can still retain mostly like a single pitch without having to build so many other overtones that you kind of lost track, right? So let me just give you a simple example. Let's change it back to sawtooth, and then let's remove all of these. So I'm just gonna do 110, and then this is just gonna stack both of these together. Um, so it's gonna double amplitude, right? And I'm gonna do a detune, and a detune means that uh, the second frequency is slightly different than the first one. Different in different that's small enough that we can't hear the difference with our ears, right? So if I only play the second tone, and then I play the first tone, right? Oh, I thought someone joined. If I play the first tone and I play the second tone, you won't be able to hear the difference in pitch. This is because our ears can't hear small differences like that in pitch. It needs to be at least like maybe uh, 5 or 10% of the original frequency for us to be able to hear a difference. Now you can hear like almost a semitone higher, right? So we don't want to go too high. We just want a little bit of that detuning, and I can play these two sounds together, which then you can hear, which now you can hear these two saws are interfering with each other, right? So this is the most clear example I can demonstrate to you what an interference is. It's basically two waveforms that are just slightly apart in their wavelengths that they start to phase between one another. And by phasing mean this pattern where it goes back and forth, back and forth. The small teeth becomes the big teeth becomes small teeth, and it just repeats, right, the pattern. So like every maybe 1/11th of a second, or sorry, that's like 1 hertz over 1/10. So like maybe like every 1 second or so, like the phases come together and you hear almost like a single tone again because the wavelengths are kind of matching, right? But the wavelengths, when they're the most apart, that's when you hear a more supersaw like sound, um, which is a detune effect. And yep, you can see at the beginning it's just the saw wave. So it phases in and out, right? And let's listen to our super saw again, the now with the prebuilt one. This is the super saw, the built-in super saw. Oh, sorry. Built-in super saw. Can you stop a little bit? Now, with the original super saw here, it's really hard to tell when the saw phases in and out. And then, although it still phases, right? If you hear closely enough, you can kind of make out the sound where three tones, where three saw waves kind of line up before they kind of spread out again, and then they come kind of sort of come together again. That's what the phasing effect is like. It's like what I call it. You have a really fast jet of air that's blowing, something like a jet flying through in the sky. That's what phasing effect sounds like. Um, excuse me. So, what if we add a third saw wave? And let's just do one let's just do one frequency less than the first one, right? How is the phasing gonna shift? How is the phasing gonna shift with three saw waves, each one off by one frequency, off by 1 hertz? Sorry. And let me play this so you can see it. Now it sounds more interesting, right? And you wonder why, like why does it? The pattern is similar than we just had the two saws, right? When they have these small teeth that comes together and then it goes away and then comes together. Now we have three small teeth, like one, two, three, that comes together and go away and comes together and go away. And you notice that when they come together, it sounds like the jet, uh, the really high velocity airflow with the jet sound. And while that is a really nice effect, normally we don't want that in our super solid because that phasing effect is distracting. You know, it's not really even. It's like an unwanted LFO effect. And and see, like I introduce you another concept right here, which is LFO, low frequency oscillator. So within these oscillators, they oscillate. You have three saw waves that oscillate their phases between one another, so that every so often these three waves come together, and then they spread apart, and then they come together again. And because the interval is periodic, you can almost call it like a low frequency oscillator, which is an oscillator on oscillators. Um, and it's the frequency is low enough so that it doesn't produce really odd harmonics, right? Because it oscillates too fast, then you get overtones or you get undertones, right? If it oscillates faster, then you get overtones. If it oscillates slower, a little bit, then it gets undertones. But if you oscillate slow enough, beyond let's say beyond let's say lower than 55 hertz that we can normally hear with our ears, then all of a sudden you can hear oscillating sounds, oscillating phases, or oscillating effects, um, just by using this method, right? So, so this is very interesting because although there's many ways to do LFOs, like this is also one of the easiest ways to start making your own LFOs. It's by superimposing in through interference. Interference pattern normally generate oscillations, right? You have two waves that interfere with each other, and it changes the property of the sound by itself. And this is a very interesting concept that I won't go too deep today, but it's something that I've also been exploring a lot. So, okay, let's go back in topic, right? Let's keep track of our time here. So, so now we have three saw waves, and now we want to control the phasing so that it doesn't sound so distracting. Another question I want to ask is, what is the ratio of the second and the third saw waves such that the phasing is the most minimal. And then again, I'm back to ratios, right? Because this one is just a ratio of 1/1/10th, and this one is also a ratio of 1/1/10th. It's a regular ratio, and because these ratio uh, is directly it's directly derived from the first one, 1/1/10th, whether it's plus or minus, we get a regular phasing effect. So in order to offset that, I may need to experiment with some really odd ratios like 2/110. Let's play this and see. And you hear a difference, right? The phasing becomes less pronounced, becomes more irregular in a sense. Right, this is before, this is after. Although it still comes together at the end, it takes longer for it to phase because the ratio is not one, it's not just 1/, the fundamental frequency. Because the frequency is 2/, the fundamental frequency, and this one is 1/, the fundamental frequency. So let's call this ratio 2:1, right? Or 2:-1. And we can still hear phasing is still audible. And now we can try with different numbers, right? This is what's really nice with code is that you can adjust the number precisely however you want and then see the effects immediately. So let's try 2⁻². Right, now we get a regular pattern again because 2⁻² is like 1:1, just like our previous example, our first example. What about 2⁻3? 2⁻3. It's much better, right? And there's a mathematical reason that comes out of this. Because if the ratio number is the same, you get 1:1, then you phase every one cycle or so. I wouldn't say one cycle, like one cycle of the low frequency oscillation, right? Which is like, I don't know, maybe half a second, maybe a quarter of a second, however long that the phasing comes together. That is what you get. That is what you get phasing for both of those waveforms, right? 2:2 is the same thing. It's just like 1:1. But 2:3 is interesting because in order for those two waveforms come together, they need to be in the same ratio. So the first wave of the offset 2 would have to take 3 times, because 2 times 3 is 6, and then -3 times 2 is 6. So it takes 3 LFO cycles for the first detune saw, and it takes 2 LFO cycles for the third saw in order for them to phase together. And isn't that interesting? Like, and you can hear it again. It sounds like they phase every 6 cycles or so. It's like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You can almost hear like a regular interval, like regular beat of like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then they phase together in like in an interval of 3 cycles almost, and every 6 cycles they almost perfectly sync. This is why like phasing is so important in learning how to phase learning how to phase your supersaw opens up so many possibilities of um, of making LFO effects, right? And then when you start learning how to use LFO, you can play around with the same concept, and you can say, hey, I want LFO1 to go twice as fast as LFO2 to get this pattern of 2 to 1, because when I love when the wave pattern comes together every two oscillations, so I can hear the beat like 1 2 and then they sync, and then 1 2 and then they sync. Uh, this is where like sound design can open up a lot of possibilities for you. But on the interest of time, I'm just gonna tell you that what I tend to use is really just 3 to 4, which I found the most pleasing, that has the least amount of noticeable phasing. So it will be 103, and then this one will be 106. Right. Let's play this. I can also try 7 over 12. Right, 7, and then minus 12. And while the phasing is barely noticeable, the detune amount is so much that it becomes unworkable. So I think 712 is an interesting ratio, but I wouldn't do it this way. Instead, I'm gonna use a technique that's called uh, that's called that's called you can call it frequency modulation, but it's really technically a vibrato effect to control the amount of detune that I want. And okay, we have a few minutes left. So a vibrato is basically just something like uh, it's like a frequency change. It, it's like an LFO frequency change. The best is to show you an example, right? If I do VIB of 4 times per second, and VIB mod, which is the modulation depth in semitones, let's say 2 semitones, or 4, let's just make it 4 semitones. You can see that the waveform goes back and forth like a spring. It's a really funny animation, but you can hear exactly what you see, and that's why it's so fun to just design sound this way, right? And the bit mod, if it's low enough, if it's less than 1 semitone, I could barely hear the pitch difference, right? But if I stack two, if I stack two sawtooth wave together with slightly, with different modulation, one is plus 0.2, one is minus 0.2, what happens? This is where like playing with modulation is so fun when you only have when you can only go up and down, right? Um, and I'm not gonna explain like using advanced modulation techniques, like harmonicity modulation, blah blah blah. It's the same concept, right? Just playing around with numbers and just add and minus, and then try to stack these two sounds together and see what happens. If I play this, you can see that they do get in phase together, but it's different than our first example, because instead of going a full phase, they, they never even get to complete a full LFO phase. Instead, they just go back to where they start. So it's like they're trying to, the two waveforms are trying to pull apart, but the vibrato basically pulls them back before they're even able to go a full phase, a full oscillation. So again, this sounds a lot with our 2 to 2 example. And if I do 3 to 2, you can hear that it comes together every 3 or 6 cycles, right? Oh, it actually comes together like every 4 or so, like kind of oscillations, which is interesting. And again, a really nice number that I found is again 3 to 4, and don't and maybe just this is in theory, like maybe it takes just like almost 12 cycles, 6 or 12 cycles to get them like completely in sync, and that's why you barely even hear the phasing, because our ears, unless you really hear it, unless you really nail the sound, most people won't be able to recognize like a phasing that occurs anything that's more than 4 cycles. So let me play this. Yeah, it's still, I think it's 3 to 4, not. I think the bib also needs to change. Uh, if I, yeah, if I recall, the vape also needs to be 3 to 4. Yeah, there you go. Yep. Now it takes about, I don't know, 6 to 12 cycles to actually come together. Um, and the higher the number go, the more cycles it needs to come together, with some exceptions. Like if you do 5, 6, it's gonna get too close to 5. So every 5 cycle you hear that. 7/12 is 7/12 is interesting. So you can play around with numbers, right? You can play around with numbers to see what you like. And 3 to 4 doesn't always mean 0.3 and 0.4. It can also mean 0.6, 0.6 and 0.8. This is also a 3 to 4 ratio, right? The higher the bit mod goes, the more the detune goes. And the more the detune goes, you can hear that the saw is kind of spread out unevenly, and the more you hear that buzzing sound, right? It's because the really sharp edges of the saw teeth are oscillating regularly. Okay, so it's 93 minutes, and I think I'm gonna stop here for now, right? Before I show the last thing, which is a 3 saw tooth oscillator, with the first one having no modulation, right? The second one is detuned by zero point 0.6 semitones, vibrating 3 times per second, and the second one is 0.8, vibrating 4 times a second. And I think this sounds at the sweet spot that I like to say. The implementation is simple enough that you can apply to build your actual Supersaw that sounds like the original Supersaw without having too much of the phasing effect. Right? If we compare it to the Supersaw now, you can see like the phasing is almost the same. And the reason why the Supersaw sounds a little bit tight is because the detune amount is less. And so the smaller the detune, the more in sync they will be at the beginning and in the middle as well, right? So I think this is more mimics the actual Supersaw. I don't want glasses, please. it sounds a lot more like the original Supersaw. I think the original Supersaw has like four or five saw waves that stack together. But you get the point, right? You can increase to like four or five, and it gives you a more spread out, a more finer sound that the teeth is not so pronounced. That the buzzing sound is less pronounced because the more teeth you have, it's like the analogy of laying on three nails as opposed to a bed of nails. If you lay on three nails, it will just hurt a lot because your pressure is basically concentrated on those three nails. But if you lay on a bed of nails that is like a lot of nails, like hundreds of nails, then you barely feel the individual nails as much, right? The same thing applies to sound as well. The more sawtooth wave that you have that spreads out, the less you can hear the individual buzz, the individual kind of brightness that is caused by these really sharp edges. It's like just having more bed of nails, right? That spread out. So sound design is an interesting topic, and honestly, I can just go on forever. But in the interest of time, I'll end here. Um, maybe I'll have another session next week if folks are interested. Because in 2 weeks, I really want to get into scales and chords. A lot of people have been asking and are interested in learning those. So at least a few people are. So thank you for watching. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing your questions and some of your knowledge. And I hope to see you again. Um, the recording will be available. Oh yeah, let me just stop the recording now. For those of you who want to watch, who want to follow up discussions, you go to the same thread that I opened in Strudel Discord. There will be a thread that you can ask questions. I'll post notes. I'll post more examples that you can try, tips and tricks and whatnot that I've shown you in this session will be made available as well. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you hopefully next week.